George Russell just delivered one of the fastest laps of the season. But minutes later, the FIA started looking at it again. Not because of a crash. Not because of a track limits violation. Because something about that lap looked different. And now the Mercedes W17 is under further scrutiny after sprint qualifying at the Chinese Grand Prix. Here is why this matters. Only 2 races into the 2026 season, Mercedes already looks like the team everyone else is chasing. Russell won in Australia. Mercedes locked out the front row again in Shanghai. And the W17 suddenly looks like the most complete car on the grid. Fast in slow corners. Fast in high-speed corners. And extremely fast on the straights. But the moment Russell crossed the line with that pole lap, engineers across the paddock immediately started analyzing the data. Because the gain in certain sectors raised a very uncomfortable question for rival teams. Was it just a perfect lap? Or did Mercedes unlock something the rest of the grid still does not fully understand? And here is the detail most people missed. This entire situation could end up revealing the real performance secret of the 2026 regulations. Something that could change the championship much earlier than anyone expected. So before we break down exactly what happened during that lap in Shanghai, and why the FIA is taking a closer look, subscribe to the channel, because what is happening inside Mercedes right now could define the entire 2026 Formula 1 season. What happened in Shanghai did not start in qualifying. It actually started hours earlier, during the only practice session of the entire sprint weekend. And that detail matters more than most people realize. Because sprint weekends in Formula 1 are brutal for engineers. Teams get only 1 hour. Just 60 minutes to understand the car, adjust the setup, and find the correct operating window. After that, the cars go straight into qualifying conditions. No second chance. No extra time to fix mistakes. Which means the teams that arrive already prepared gain a massive advantage. And in China, one team clearly arrived more prepared than anyone else. Mercedes. From the very first runs in practice, the W17 looked calm on track. Not nervous. Not unpredictable. Just planted. George Russell immediately jumped to the top of the timing screens. Then something even more interesting happened. Right behind him was his teammate, Kimi Antonelli. First and second. Same team. And the gap to the rest of the grid was impossible to ignore. Inside the paddock, engineers from rival teams started watching the Mercedes very carefully. Because the car looked comfortable in every part of the circuit. Shanghai is not an easy track to master. The opening corner alone lasts forever. Drivers turn in, hold the steering angle, and keep tightening the line while carrying speed for several seconds. If a car has balance problems, this is where they appear immediately. But the Mercedes looked completely stable through that section. No corrections. No hesitation from the driver. Then came the heavy braking zones. Another moment where instability usually shows up. Still nothing. The car stayed composed. And when Russell accelerated onto the long straight, the speed difference suddenly became obvious. The W17 was gaining time. Not a little. A lot. And this is where things started to raise eyebrows inside the paddock. Because the new 2026 regulations changed how these cars behave on straights. Teams now rely heavily on energy deployment. And on the active aerodynamic systems that adjust the front wing to reduce drag. In theory, every team has access to the same concepts. But in reality, the execution is everything. How smoothly the wing transitions. How the energy system releases power. How the car balances itself when drag suddenly disappears. If those elements are not perfectly synchronized, the car becomes unstable. And drivers lose confidence. But the Mercedes looked like it had solved that puzzle already. Which is extremely unusual this early in a new regulation era. Most teams spend months trying to perfect those systems. Yet in Shanghai, Mercedes looked like they already understood them. Almost completely. By the time sprint qualifying began later that day, the mood inside the paddock had already shifted. People were no longer asking if Mercedes was fast. That question had already been answered. The real question now was something much bigger. How fast are they actually? And more importantly, did they just unlock the key advantage of the 2026 regulations before anyone else did? Because if the answer to that question is yes, then what happened during Russell's qualifying lap might not just be a great performance. It might be the first real signal that the entire competitive order of Formula 1 is about to change. Sprint qualifying began with tension already building inside the paddock. Because after practice, everyone understood one thing. Mercedes was not just quick. They were operating on a different level. And sessions like this expose everything. Sprint qualifying moves fast. There is no time to slowly build pace. Drivers go out almost immediately, pushing the limits of the car. Which is exactly what George Russell did. From the first phase of the session, the Mercedes looked extremely comfortable. Russell completed his opening lap and immediately jumped near the top of the timing screens. Then the track began to evolve. Grip increased. Lap times started dropping across the grid. But something interesting kept happening. Every time the times improved, Russell improved as well. He was not just fast once. He was fast every single run. That consistency is something engineers notice immediately. Because when a driver can repeat performance like that, it usually means the car is predictable, stable, and easy to place exactly where the driver wants it. Meanwhile, other teams were struggling to find that same rhythm. Ferrari looked competitive in certain sectors, but not the entire lap. McLaren gained time in some corners, then lost it on the straights. And Red Bull looked completely out of balance. Max Verstappen's radio messages told the whole story. He was fighting the car through almost every corner, complaining about grip, complaining about balance. At one point he even described the situation as a disaster, which is something you almost never hear from a driver used to dominating Formula One. While that chaos unfolded around the grid, Mercedes stayed calm. Almost too calm. Antonelli comfortably advanced through the session. Russell did the same. Both cars moving through each qualifying phase without drama. And that is exactly when the pressure begins to build. Because when a team looks that comfortable early in the session, the final segment becomes very dangerous for everyone else. That final run is where drivers push everything. Maximum deployment. Maximum grip. Maximum risk. And if a car already looks strong before that moment, the final lap can become something very difficult to match. Which brings us to the moment that changed the entire conversation in Shanghai. The final attempts in the last phase of sprint qualifying. All the cars on track. All the drivers pushing for the fastest lap possible. The timing screens updating corner after corner. And right in the middle of that chaos, George Russell began the lap that now has the entire paddock talking. A lap that looked smooth, controlled, almost effortless. But when the sector times started appearing, engineers across the pit lane suddenly leaned forward. Because the numbers they were seeing did not just suggest a fast lap. They suggested something much more serious. And what happened in the middle sector of that lap is exactly where the investigation questions begin. Russell crossed the start line and immediately committed to the lap. No hesitation. Turn 1 in Shanghai is not really a normal corner. It feels more like a tightening spiral. Drivers enter at high speed, then slowly close the steering while the corner keeps tightening underneath them. If the front of the car loses grip here, the lap is already compromised. But Russell carried incredible speed into the entry. The Mercedes stayed planted. No correction. No visible struggle for balance. The car rotated smoothly and accelerated toward the next section. Then came the technical middle part of the circuit. This is where most drivers lose time. Because the sequence demands perfect rhythm. Brake. Rotate. Short acceleration. Another direction change. And if the car is even slightly unstable, the driver has to lift the throttle. That costs tenths immediately. But Russell did not lift. Telemetry comparisons later suggested something unusual. Through that middle sector, the Mercedes gained time in places where other cars were losing it. Not dramatically in a single corner, but everywhere. A few hundredths here. Another few hundredths there. Small gains stacking together. And that is the kind of pattern engineers notice instantly. Because it suggests the car is doing something extremely efficient in the transitions. Particularly when switching from cornering load to straight line speed. Which brings us to the most important section of the lap. The exit leading onto Shanghai's long straight. This is where energy deployment and aerodynamic efficiency become critical. Drivers exit the final corner before the straight and immediately open the throttle completely. At that exact moment, several systems inside the car begin working together. Energy deployment from the hybrid system, rear traction management, and the activation of the straight-line aerodynamic mode. If those systems are not perfectly synchronized, the driver feels it instantly. The car becomes nervous. The steering feels light. Sometimes the rear becomes unstable as drag suddenly drops. But Russell's car looked incredibly smooth in that moment. The transition happened almost invisibly. And that is where the numbers started to shock the paddock. Because the speed trace showed the Mercedes accelerating earlier than most cars. And continuing to gain speed further down the straight. Now here is where things become extremely interesting. Under the 2026 regulations, the interaction between the active front wing and the hybrid power deployment is tightly controlled. The system must operate within very specific limits. Timing windows. Activation behavior. Energy release patterns. All of it monitored carefully. So when rival teams began comparing Russell's sector times and speed traces, a question started circulating quietly inside engineering rooms. Not publicly. Not yet. But internally. Was Mercedes simply executing the system better than everyone else? Or did the W17 find a way to maximize the straight mode effect more efficiently than the rest of the grid? Because if the answer is the second possibility, then Russell's lap might reveal something much bigger than a single pole position. It could reveal the first real technical advantage of the 2026 era. And that possibility is exactly why the FIA is now taking a closer look at the data from that lap. Not because something obvious looked illegal, but because sometimes, in Formula One, the most important discoveries begin with something very simple. A lap that looks almost too perfect.